Good morning, and welcome to part 9 of our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. And as we continue in trying to decipher Solomon's meaning for the meaning of life between a God and no God, we'll start chapter 4. Now, in the first two chapters, Solomon's pretty well shown that without God, with only secularism in your life, almost everything you end up doing is really meaningless. It really ends up, in the long run, as being without meaning. Whatever you do, it seems to be just passing. And when you pass away, then whatever you have done is left to someone behind you who may do nothing with it, who may abolish it, who may squander it. Therefore, what you do in this world by itself really ends up to being very little in the long run. But although Solomon sort of indicated this without God, then he comes back to indicating that there must be a God because there is a time for everything. There is a time and a place and a pattern, a program to the world which underlies everything we do. And no matter what we end up doing, we really can't, to any great extent, change this pattern. And therefore, there must be somebody, some God, some being controlling this organization. So Solomon sort of brings up some hope that there must be some kind of meaning from God because of this. But then he also gets depressed again because he talks about all the injustice in the world, the injustice that happens. There is wickedness in the place of judgment. There is iniquity in the place of righteousness. And that this seems to indicate that that God himself either can't control what is going on in the world, or that he doesn't care what's going on in the world. And then Solomon again comes back on the other vein and indicates that this must mean that there is a judgment afterwards, that regardless of what these people do, that they will be judged in another time for the deeds that they do on this earth. And he indicates this also as well when he says that there is a time for every purpose under heaven. God tests men that they may see that they themselves are like animals in the secular sense. Everyone dies, everyone goes to the same place, and there is really no difference between man and animals if this is all there is to being. So he comes to the conclusion that there must be a time and a place for judgment and for reconciliation after this world is over. But now he gets in chapter 4, he gets again another question, another query which is bothering him. And he says this: "Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun. And look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter." Solomon saying that many of the peoples, many of the places in the world are down and out. They're oppressed because of other peoples and other places and other realms. And there seem to be nobody to comfort them. And this has been a theme which is not only in Solomon's book, but in the Bible itself. And we know today that there are many peoples, many nations that are oppressed in a number of ways. The Bible talks about oppression in a number of different ways. For instance, in Proverbs 28:16, it talks about the oppression of people by a king. In Deuteronomy 24:14, it talks about oppression of a servant by a master. In Proverbs 22:16, it talks about oppression of the poor by the wealthy. In Ecclesiastes 5, in the next chapter, it talks about oppression of the poor by bureaucracy. In Proverbs 28:3, it talks of oppression of the poor by other poor people. In Jeremiah 7, verse 6, Ezekiel 22:7, and Zechariah 7:10, it talks about the oppression of the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. And in Ezekiel 22, both verses 12 and 29, it talks about oppression by people being charged exorbitant interest. And in Hosea 12:7, it talks about oppression by using false means, measures, and weights. There's talk about oppression throughout the Bible. Some people have always been oppressed. And this has caused many people to lose their faith in God as a result of this. Dr. Jeremiah, in his book, Searching for Heaven and Earth, talks about a son, Wiesenthal, who was in the Second World War in a concentration camp in the Holocaust. And he lost his faith in God when he saw a Nazi officer line up two Jewish men back to back and then shoot both with one bullet, indicating to his fellow soldiers that this was a way to save bullets. He lost his faith in God, and perhaps we can understand that. It's very difficult to give answers to all these questions. And no one really can do it satisfactorily. And Solomon himself could find no satisfactory answer, even though at his time and in his place there was just as much oppression then as there seems to be now. But there's also another example in a book written by Mark Sidwell called Free Indeed, Heroes of the Black Christian History. He talks about a Charles Tindley. This person was a black man who was a slave, but who ended up as being a preacher. He started as a church janitor and ended up being a preacher, a very famous preacher at the time, who had a large congregation. But he never really achieved very much in the secular world. He was believed to have been oppressed most of his life. He faced repression. He went once to become a bishop in the church, and he was told that he was an unlettered ignoramus. He had no ability, no education fit to be a bishop. He also received an anonymous report that he was immoral, and he was denied the position of being a bishop. Although he had a large church, he remained poor. He died a pauper. He was buried in an unmarked grave. He also lost his wife. His son was killed during World War I, and his ministry was always in poverty. He was oppressed. He had much oppression. And yet he, unlike Mr. Wiesenthal, retained his faith in God and went on to write a number of hymns, one of which was called I'll Overcome Someday. And this went on to become We Shall Overcome, the rallying hymn of the anti-segregationist movement. He also wrote Stand By Me, Nothing Between My Soul and the Savior, and We'll Understand It All by and by. This Solomon says, we don't understand it all now, but we'll understand it all by and by. He goes on to say, Solomon goes on to say in his book, therefore, because of the oppression, I praised the dead who were already dead, more than the living who were still alive. Yet better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. Solomon felt the oppression to such an extent that he felt probably it would be better never to have been born than to go through this oppression. He wasn't the only one. Job also felt the same way. Job, in chapter 3, verse 3 and 7, reported this: "May the day perish on which I was born, and the night in which it was said, a male child is conceived. Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb?" Job, if you recall, was a man who initially had everything. And at the same time, God allowed Satan to take it all from him. His wealth, his animals and equipment, his family, everyone except his wife, his own health. He lost everything. His wife said, "Curse God and live." But Job refused to. He questioned God, and he certainly bemoaned his situation, but he did not turn away from God. And in the end, in the book of Job, it shows that he had everything restored to him. There are examples today as well of people who lose everything, who the world seems to turn against, who are oppressed to a considerable degree. And then the situation arises: do you fall back on God, or do you turn away from God? And this is a decision which everybody in that situation has to understand, and a decision people have to make. In Psalm 73, David talks about this: "But as for me, my feet had almost stumbled, my steps had nearly slipped, for I was envious of the boastful when I saw the prosperity of the wicked." He felt the same way when he saw the prosperity of the wicked, when he saw how people who were wealthy, who had it all, who had power, oppressed others. He almost slipped. But then I said, when I thought how to understand this, it was too painful for me until I went into the sanctuary of God. Then I understood their end. So if we do not go away from God, perhaps we'll understand this. Perhaps the end and the full meaning of what God is doing will become apparent to us, so that you won't have to say, as Job did, "I wish I had never been born." And perhaps people who feel that way would have a better hope and a better chance of living throughout a life, rather than sometimes taking their lives as they do today. So Solomon talks about the oppression of the poor by the powerful, the oppression of the weak by the strong. And then he gets on to the other verses. There's another kind of oppression here, which is just as bad. And he talks about the oppression of people who try to do too much, the vainness of people who oppress themselves by trying to do too much, become too much during this lifetime. He says, "Again I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind." Part of the problem with the modern world, and the world back in Solomon's time, is that people often try to do more, try to achieve more, sometimes by using devious means, try to advance themselves, not just for themselves, not just to give ahead, but to show themselves make themselves envious, so they will be envied by others, so that they can sort of look with pride upon what they've done and cause others to be envy and jealous. It's sort of like keeping up with the Joneses in a sense. So he said, to do this is all just meaningless. This is all vanity. To keep doing things just for the sake of building up your own pride, or trying to make other people jealous, or trying to be boastful in your own way, is nothing more in the end but vanity and just meaningless work. But he also says, The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. So that although it is not good to be to work to the extent that you're trying to make yourself better than others, or you're trying to make others envious of you, it's also not good just to do nothing. The idea is that you want to do it in a meaningful way, in a balanced way, because it says, better a handful with quietness, better a handful with contentment, than both hands full, together with toil and grasping for the wind. So to try to become somebody more for the sake of making others envious or others jealous, or to become envious and jealous of others who have done it, is really nothing more than grasping for the wind. Edward Luther called it envy is basically a rebellion against God's plan. J.G. Parker said envy is dangerous because it is fed by pride. Billy Graham said this, that envy is the opposite of love, for love rejoices in the good fortune of others. Proverbs 6:10 and 11 says, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep is still good, so still your poverty comes again like a prowler. Proverbs 15:16, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure with trouble. Better is a little with righteousness than great rewards without justice. So Solomon is saying in this section that there is oppression, and that the oppression is there because the power, the strong are powerful. The weak have really little to go to help them except God himself, and to understand that yes, there is oppression, but in the end this will be taken care of the same way that injustice is. But one of the things that causes oppression is the ambitions of some people to make themselves envied by others, to make themselves powerful, to get ahead with using devious means. And therefore, this is a way that causes oppression both for those under them and causes their own oppression because of their desires and their way that they live their life. And he says this is vanity. This is nothing more but meaningless activity in the long run. It is better to have a little balance. It is better to be content with a little than to have an awful lot and be miserable. It is not good to be do nothing. It is not good to be lazy. It is not good to do nothing, because by doing that you just consume yourself. You just live your own, you just destroy your own life. So do work, have some ambition, have some contentment. Control the ambition so that your contentment is not overcome by your ambition. Enjoy life. Have a balance. Everything else is vanity. So we'll go on to the second part of chapter 4 in the next lesson. That's enough for today. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.